I've watched enough folks over the years to know that grief doesn't look the way you'd expect. Those hurting most often disappear quiet, searching for somewhere the world won't find them. And sometimes, the place they choose to end becomes where something new begins. I saw it happen once, Arizona desert, 1884. The cry came past midnight. Mateo's eyes snapped open. He lay on bare planks in the abandoned shack he had bought that morning, a place to wait for the desert to finish what grief had started. The sound came again, thin, wavering. Not a coyote, human. His hand found the knife at his belt. He struck a match. The sulfur flare throwing shadows across adobe walls. The back room door, he had ignored it when he arrived, assuming pack rats. Another cry, weaker now, the unmistakable mewling of a newborn. He moved toward the door, boards groaning beneath his boots. His fingers touched the handle. The crying stopped. In that sudden silence, he heard breathing. Rapid, terrified. Someone waited on the other side. If you're watching from somewhere quiet tonight, I'd love to hear where home is for you. And if you've been enjoying these stories without subscribing, consider joining us. It means more than you know. Mateo pushed the door open. The match trembled in his fingers, throwing a small circle of orange light into the room. Dust hung thick in the air. The smell hit him first. Sweat, iron, something sour and animal. His stomach clenched. In the far corner, a shape moved, a woman. Young, dark hair matted to her face. Eyes so wide the whites showed all around. She pressed herself against the adobe wall, arms wrapped around a bundle at her chest. The bundle squirmed, made a sound like a kitten drowning. No hurt? Her voice cracked, barely a whisper. No hurt. Baby, please. The match burned down to Mateo's fingers. He hissed, dropped it, and the room went black. He heard her shuffle backward, heard the scrape of her heels against the wooden floor, the ragged pull of her breathing. He struck another match. She hadn't moved far, couldn't. Her legs had given out beneath her, and she sat slumped against the wall, still clutching the infant. A canteen lay tipped on its side near her knee bone, not a drop left. Apache. The cradle board beside her, cracked down the middle, the beadwork on her dress. Faded but unmistakable, moccasins worn through at the soles, the leather splitting. The baby's cry had gone silent. Its mouth opened and closed. But no sound came out. Too weak. Mateo's throat tightened. He didn't think. His hand went to his own canteen, still half full from the ride out. He uncorked it, held it toward her. She flinched like he'd raised a weapon. Water, he said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, rusty. He hadn't spoken to another person in 3 days. Just water. She stared at the canteen, then at him. Her cracked lips parted. She reached for it with a hand that shook so badly she nearly dropped it. She drank 3 swallows, then pulled the canteen away and tilted it toward the baby's mouth. Letting drops fall onto its tongue, the infant stirred, swallowed, made a small mewling sound. The woman looked up at Mateo. Her eyes glistened in the matchlight. How long? He asked. She didn't understand. He pointed at the empty canteen on the floor, held up one finger, 2, 3. Water gone, she said slowly. Sun come up. Water gone. Since this morning, the Arizona sun, a newborn, the match burned out, in the darkness. Mateo heard the baby begin to cry again, stronger now, angry, demanding. Morning light pushed through the gaps in the roof, striping the floor in pale gold. Mateo had not slept. He sat against the far wall, knees drawn up, watching the woman and her child. She had dozed in fits through the night, jerking awake every time the baby stirred, her hand flying to the bundle before her eyes fully opened. Now she was awake, watching him back. Neither had spoken since the darkness. Mateo pushed himself to his feet. His joints popped. 40 hours without real sleep, and his body felt like something left out in weather. He crossed to his saddlebag, pulled out a strip of jerky wrapped in cheesecloth, and set water to boil over the small fire he'd built in the corner hearth. The woman tracked his every movement. He tore the jerky into pieces, dropped them into the tin cup, let the boiling water soften the dried meat into something like broth. The smell rose salt, smoke, animal fat. His stomach twisted, but he ignored it. He carried the cup across the room, set it on the floor between them, stepped back. She didn't move. "Ain't poison," he said, same words as last night. "Got no reason to poison you." Her eyes flicked from the cup to his face, back to the cup. The baby made a small sound against her chest, not crying, just breathing, the wet rattle of a newborn's lungs. She reached for the cup with her free hand, brought it to her lips, sipped, waited, sipped again. Mateo let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. "Mateo," he said, pointing to his chest. "My name." She watched him over the rim of the cup. "Mateo," she repeated slowly, testing the syllables. He nodded. "Nijoni," she said. Her voice was stronger now, though still rough. She touched her collarbone. "I am Nijoni." The name sat strange on his tongue when Fee tried it. She almost smiled, just a flicker at the corner of her mouth, gone before it fully formed. The baby squirmed. Nijoni set down the cup and adjusted the bundle, pulling aside the torn blanket to check the infant's face. A girl. Mateo saw now, tiny fingers curling and uncurling, skin still ruddy from birth. "The father," Mateo said. Nijoni's face changed. The openness that had crept in vanished, replaced by something hard and flat. She looked down at her daughter. "Garrett," she said. The name came out bitter. "He say, Mary, he bring gifts, pretty things." She made a motion with her hand, something appearing, then disappearing. "Then baby come. He go. He ran. He go," she repeated. "My people say, shame, I bring shame, so I go too." Mateo said nothing. There was nothing to say. He knew the weight of being left, knew the silence that followed when the person who should have stayed didn't. He stood abruptly. "Stay here. Rest. When you're strong enough, you can go." The words came out harsher than he intended. He saw her flinch, saw her arms tighten around the baby. He turned away before he could see more. Outside, the sun was already brutal. Heat shimmered off the sand, bending the distant mesas into wavering shapes. Mateo walked to where his mule stood, hobbled in the thin shade of a mesquite tree. He retrieved his hammer, the handle cracked but still serviceable, and a coil of rope. The roof. He would fix the roof. His hands needed work. His mind needed something other than the woman's eyes, the baby's silence, the way his own voice had sounded when he said she could leave. He climbed onto the low adobe wall, testing his weight. The timbers groaned but held. He began pulling away the rotted sections, tossing them to the sand below. The physical labor helped the stretch of muscle, the ache in his shoulders, the sweat that began to soak through his shirt. An hour passed, maybe 2. The sun crawled higher. Mateo paused to drink from his canteen, rationing now, calculating how soon he would need to ride to the spring 3 miles east. When he turned back to his work, something made him glance toward the shack's single window. Nijoni sat in a stripe of light that fell through the glass. The baby lay across her lap, and she was singing so softly he could barely hear it. A melody that rose and fell like water over stones. Her hand moved in slow circles on the infant's back. Her face, in that light, had lost its fear. Mateo's hammer hung in the air, mid-swing. He watched them, mother and child, framed in gold, and something in his chest shifted. Not warmth, not yet. Something more like pressure, like a door that had been nailed shut, straining against its frame. He brought the hammer down. The nails sank deep. By evening, the worst of the roof was patched. Mateo filled the kerosene lamp for the first time, and the three of them sat in its small circle of light. The woman, the baby, and the man who had come here to disappear. Nijoni spoke first. "You," she said. "Why here? This place?" "Nothing." Mateo looked at the flame. "That's why," he said. She studied him. He felt her gaze like a hand pressed to his back, searching for the wound. "Your wife," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Mateo's throat closed. His fingers tightened on his knees. Outside, a coyote called, then another, answering from somewhere farther in the dark. The lamp flickered in a draft that crept through the walls he had not yet sealed. Nijoni did not ask again, but she did not look away either. 7 days passed, and the shack began to smell different. Smoke from the cooking fire, the faint sweetness of boiled cactus. Something underneath it all, milk, maybe, or the particular warmth of a body other than his own. Mateo noticed it when he came in from checking his rabbit snares each morning. The smell hit him at the door, and each time his step faltered for half a second before he made himself move forward. Nijoni had claimed the corner near the hearth. She had swept the packed earth floor with a bundle of dried grass, arranged the few supplies into neat rows, fashioned a bed for herself and the baby from Mateo's spare blanket and a pile of dried mesquite leaves. The baby slept in a curve of cloth against her chest most hours. But sometimes Nijoni laid her on the blanket and let her kick her small legs in the light that came through the patched roof. The baby was getting stronger. Mateo could hear it in her cries, fuller now, angrier. The thin mewling of that first night, replaced by something that demanded attention. Her skin had lost its worrying pallor. Her eyes tracked movement. He tried not to notice, tried to focus on the work instead. The roof needed more patching. The east wall had a crack that would let in rain if the monsoons came. The door hung crooked on its leather hinges. He made a list in his head each morning and worked through it until the sun dropped low enough that he couldn't see his hands anymore. Nijoni watched him work. Sometimes she spoke. "This plant," she said one afternoon, pointing to a cluster of spiny pads growing near the shack's foundation. "Prickly pear. You cut here," she mimed with her fingers. "Take off the spines. Cook with fire. Good. Fill the belly." Mateo looked at the cactus. He had walked past it 100 times. "Never knew you could eat it," he said. "White man eyes," Nijoni said. The corner of her mouth twitched. "You see green. I see food." He almost laughed, caught himself, turned back to the wall he was patching. The next morning, he showed her how to split kindling without losing a finger. She had been hacking at a mesquite branch with his hand axe, the blade glancing off the hard wood at dangerous angles. "Hold it here," he said, positioning her grip. His hand brushed hers, calluses against calluses, and he pulled back too quickly. "Steady. One stroke." Let the weight do the work. She tried. The branch split clean. Again, Mateo said. By the time the sun was high, she had a pile of kindling stacked beside the hearth. She looked at it with something that might have been pride, though her face stayed mostly still. The baby cried. Nijoni went to her. Mateo stood in the doorway, watching them. The light fell across Nijoni's shoulder, caught the dark shine of her hair. The baby's hand waved in the air, grasping at nothing. He turned away, walked out to check the snares. That evening, they sat across from each other on overturned crates, the closest thing to chair the shack offered. Mateo had fashioned a table from a barrel and 2 planks of salvaged wood. On it sat a tin plate of roasted rabbit, strips of cactus boiled soft, 2 cups of water. Nijoni ate slowly, one hand always near the baby sleeping in the cloth sling against her chest. She needs a name, Mateo said. He hadn't meant to say it. The words came out before he could stop them. Nijoni looked up. Her eyes searched his face. Name comes when spirit shows itself, she said carefully. Apache way. Has it showed itself? Nijoni was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked down at the baby, at the small, sleeping face. The tiny fist curled against the blanket. Dolly, she said softly. She is Dolly. What does it mean? Bluebird. Nijoni's voice shifted, something lighter entering it. The bird that comes when things are... As she searched for the word, when the hard time ends, when warmth returns. Springbird, Mateo said. Yes. Nijoni nodded. Spring. The baby stirred at the sound of her own name. Her eyes opened dark, unfocused, and her mouth stretched into something that might have been a yawn or might have been the beginning of a cry. Instead, her hand found Mateo's finger, where it rested on the edge of the table, tiny fingers wrapped around it, gripping with surprising strength. Nijoni laughed. The sound startled both of them. She covered her mouth, eyes widening, as if the laugh had escaped without permission. Mateo stared at her. He could not remember the last time he had heard a woman laugh. Not since. He pulled his hand back, stood, walked outside into the cooling dark. The stars were coming out, scattered across the sky like spilled salt. Mateo stood with his back to the shack, breathing slow, waiting for his chest to loosen. Inside, he heard Nijoni singing again, that same soft melody, rising and falling. He stayed outside until his hands stopped shaking. 3 days later, Mateo returned from a hunt to find his shirt draped over the barrel table. He stopped in the doorway, stared. The shirt had been torn across the back for weeks, caught on a nail when he was patching the roof. He had ignored it, wearing it anyway, the fabric gaping open whenever he bent down. Now the tear was gone. Small, even stitches ran along what had been the rip. The thread a slightly different shade than the faded cotton, but neat and tight. Nijoni knelt near the hearth, feeding sticks to the fire. She did not look up. Mateo picked up the shirt. His fingers traced the mended seam. The stitches were precise, practiced. Someone had taught her well. Elena used to mend his shirts. She would sit by the window in their cabin in Colorado, her needle flashing in the afternoon light, humming songs she'd learned from her mother in Sonora. He would come home from the timber camp and find his torn work clothes folded on the bed. Made whole again, the shirt blurred in his vision. He blinked, swallowed, set the shirt back down. "Thank you," he said. His voice came out rough. Nijoni looked up then. She studied his face, the tight line of his jaw, the way his hands hung at his sides. Your wife, she said quietly. She do this too. It was not a question. Mateo could not answer. He walked past her, out the back door, into the heat of the afternoon. His boots carried him 50 yards from the shack before his legs gave out, and he sat down hard in the dust, his back against a boulder, his face turned away from the windows. The desert stretched before him endless, indifferent. He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes until he saw stars. When he finally returned, the sun was setting. Nijoni had set his mended shirt on the crate he used as a pillow. Beside it, she had placed Elena's Bible, the one with the pressed wildflower, inside, the one he had not touched since the day he arrived. The Bible was open to a page near the middle. Mateo looked at Nijoni. She sat with Dolly in her arms, her face unreadable. "The flower," she said. "It fell out. I put it back." Mateo crossed to the Bible, looked down at the page she had opened it to. The dried wildflower lay pressed against the words. Its petals faded to the color of old bone. The page was from Ruth. Nijoni could not read English. She could not have known. And yet, Mateo's hand hovered over the page, outside. The coyotes began their evening chorus, their voices rising from the arroyos and mesas. Inside, the lamp threw its small circle of gold. The baby made a sound, not a cry, but something softer, almost a coo. Mateo closed the Bible gently, the wildflower safe inside. When he looked up, Nijoni was watching him with eyes that held no demand, no expectation, only witness, somewhere far off. Hooves drummed against packed earth, faint but unmistakable, coming closer. The flower was almost gone. Mateo stood in the dim light of early morning, staring at the burlap sack slumped against the wall. A handful left, maybe 2. The salt tin was empty. He had been rationing both for 3 days, hoping he could put off the inevitable a little longer. He could not. Nijoni was awake, nursing Dolly in the corner. She watched him without speaking, her dark eyes following as he strapped on his belt, the knife and canteen, not the revolver buried in his saddlebag that he hadn't touched in months. "Town," he said. "Need supplies." She nodded once. "I'll be back before dark." She shifted Dolly to her other arm. Her free hand reached into the folds of her dress and withdrew a small leather pouch. She held it toward him. "For baby," she said. "Cloth, soft cloth, if they have." Mateo took the pouch. It weighed almost nothing, a few coins, maybe 3 or 4, everything she had. "I'll look," he said. He turned to go. Her voice stopped him at the door. "You come back." He looked over his shoulder. She sat very still. Dolly pressed to her chest, her face carefully blank. But her hand had tightened on the baby, and something in the set of her shoulders told him this was not an idle question. "Said I would." White men say many things. The words hung between them. Mateo heard what she did not say, the traitor, the promises, the empty road. "I ain't Garrett," he said. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded, just once, and looked down at her daughter. Mateo walked out into the pale dawn. The ride to Dusty Flats took 3 hours. His mule picked its way through arroyos and across flats of cracked earth, the sun climbing higher with each mile. By the time the town's buildings appeared on the horizon, low shapes shimmering in the heat, sweat had soaked through his shirt and the back of his neck was starting to burn. Dusty Flats was not much of a town. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith's shed, a cluster of adobe houses, and a wooden church with a crooked steeple. Maybe 200 souls. if you counted the ranches scattered in the surrounding hills. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and news traveled faster than the mail. Mateo hitched his mule to the post outside the general store. The boardwalk creaked under his boots. A woman in a calico dress standing near the door glanced at him, then quickly away, pulling her child closer to her skirts. He pushed through the door. The shopkeeper stood behind the counter, a heavy-set man with a gray beard and small eyes that missed nothing. His name was Harlan. He had sold Mateo the Hendricks place 3 weeks ago with barely concealed relief at unloading the worthless property. Now, those small eyes narrowed. "Rivers," Harlan said. His voice was flat. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon." "Need flour," Mateo said. "Salt, whatever oil you've got." He moved toward the shelves, scanning the goods: burlap sacks of grain, tins of lard, jars of preserves lined up in dusty rows. In the corner, a rack held bolts of fabric wool, cotton, and one roll of something softer. Flannel, maybe. "Hear you got company out there." Mateo's hand paused on a sack of flour. "Just need the supplies," he said. Harlan did not move from behind the counter. "Folks talk, is all. Indian woman, they say, and a baby." Mateo lifted the flour sack, set it on the counter, reached for a tin of salt. "Folks talk a lot." "They do." Harlan's eyes followed him. "Ain't Christian, some say. Man living out there with a savage and her whelp." The tin of salt landed on the counter harder than Mateo intended. The sound echoed in the quiet store. "The flour," Mateo said. "The salt. How much?" A long silence stretched between them. Then Harlan shrugged and named a price higher than it should have been. But Mateo did not argue. He counted out the coins, added a bottle of cooking oil, and reached for the soft cloth he had spotted earlier. "And a yard of that flannel." Harlan's eyebrows rose. "For the baby, is it?" Mateo did not answer. He laid Nijoni's coins on the counter alongside his own, gathered his goods, and turned toward the door. A woman stood near the entrance, watching. She was older than the one outside, gray threading through her brown hair, her face lined by sun and years. She wore a flour sack apron over a plain dress, and her hands were red and rough from work. Mrs. Henley, the shopkeeper's wife. She looked at the flannel in Mateo's arms, then at his face. Her expression was different from her husband's, not hostile, but searching. Curious. She glanced at the coins he had used, the small leather pouch, now empty on the counter, and something flickered in her eyes. "That's good cloth for a little one," she said quietly. "Soft." Mateo nodded, moved past her toward the door. Outside, the sun hit him like a fist. He blinked, adjusting his grip on the supplies, and stepped off the boardwalk toward his mule. A shadow fell across his path. "Rivers." Mateo stopped, looked up. 3 men stood between him and his mule. The one in front was tall and lean, with a weathered face and eyes the color of bleached bone. He wore a rancher's clothes, dusty chaps, a sweat-stained hat, boots with spurs that clinked when he shifted his weight. Calhoun. Mateo had seen him at a distance when he bought the Hendricks place, owned a spread to the north, had opinions about everything, and shared them loudly. "Word of advice, friend," Calhoun said. His voice was soft, almost friendly. "Send her back where she belongs, before things get complicated." Mateo's fingers tightened on the flour sack. "And where's that?" "Reservation, her kind." Calhoun smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "You're a decent man. From what I hear, Colorado. Wasn't it logger folks can forgive a lapse in judgment, if a man corrects it quick enough? The two men behind Calhoun shifted, blocking the path to the street. They were younger, broader, with the thick hands of men who worked cattle. Mateo looked at them, then back at Calhoun. "Thanks for the advice." He stepped forward. Calhoun did not move. "Ain't advice. Rivers." The softness was gone from his voice now. "It's fair warning. Decent folk got standards. You do well to remember that." Mateo stood close enough to smell the man's sweat, the leather of his chaps, the tobacco staining his teeth. His heart hammered against his ribs. His hands itched for something they had not wanted in years, not the knife at his belt, but the fists that had gotten him thrown out of 3 mining camps before he was 25. He could hit Calhoun, drop the flour, drive his knuckles into that weathered jaw, feel the impact shiver up his arm. The two behind would be on him in seconds, but he could get in at least one good blow. Elena's voice drifted through his memory. "You've got hands for building, Mateo, not breaking." He exhaled, stepped around Calhoun, his shoulder brushing the man's arm as he passed. Calhoun did not try to stop him. "We'll be seeing you, Rivers," he called after him. "Count on it." Mateo loaded the supplies onto his mule. His hands were steady, but something had locked in his jaw, some tension that would not release. He mounted and turned the animal toward the road out of town, at the edge of dusty flats. He looked back once. Calhoun stood where he had left him, watching. The two men flanked him like shadows. None of them moved. The ride back took longer. The sun was brutal, and Mateo stopped twice to water the mule and rest in what little shade he could find. The shack came into view as the sun touched the western mesas. Mateo reined in his mule, stopped. The door was closed, but that was not unusual. What made him pause was the silence, no smoke from the chimney, no sound of Nijoni's singing drifting across the sand. He dismounted slowly, led the mule forward. The shack's single window was dark inside. Mateo dropped the mule's reins and crossed to the door in 3 long strides. His hand found the latch. He pushed it open. The room was empty. The blankets were gone. The cradle board, the supplies, the small pile of belongings Nijoni had gathered, all of it vanished. On the barrel table, weighted down by a stone, lay the flannel cloth he had bought that morning. But Nijoni and Dolly were nowhere to be seen. Mateo tore through the shack, throwing open the back door, scanning the desert in every direction. Nothing. Sand and scrub and the long shadows of evening. His breath came ragged, his pulse hammering in his ears. She had seen the riders. She had hidden. He forced himself to stop, to think. The arroyo, 100 yards east, where the land dropped into a dry creek bed lined with mesquite and creosote, deep enough to hide in, close enough to reach quickly with a baby in her arms. He ran. The sand dragged at his boots. The fading light turned the landscape into shades of amber and gray. He reached the edge of the arroyo and scrambled down the crumbling bank, stones skittering beneath his feet. "Nijoni." His voice echoed off the walls of the creek bed. Silence answered. He moved deeper, pushing through the brush. Thorns caught at his sleeves. A jackrabbit bolted from a clump of sage, making him flinch. "Nijoni, it's me. It's Mateo." A sound, faint, coming from behind a thick stand of mesquite. He pushed through the branches and found her. She sat wedged into a hollow between 2 boulders. Dolly pressed tight against her chest. Her eyes were wide, her body coiled like a spring. In her hand, she held a rock the size of her fist. raised and ready. When she saw his face, her arm dropped. The rock fell from her fingers. "Riders," she said. Her voice shook. "3 men. I hear hooves from the window. See dust. They come to the shack. They look in the windows. I hide." Mateo crouched in front of her. His hands hung at his sides, careful not to reach for her. "They're gone now. I saw them in town. They come back. Maybe." He could not lie to her. "Probably." She looked down at Dolly. The baby slept. Oblivious, one small fist curled against the blanket. "I bring trouble," Nijoni said quietly. "For you. I should go." "No." The word came out sharper than he intended. She looked up, startled. "No," he said again, softer this time. "Come back to the shack. It's getting cold." She hesitated. Then she let him help her to her feet. They walked back in silence, the last light bleeding from the sky. By the time they reached the shack, stars had begun to prick through the darkness. Mateo built up the fire while Nijoni settled Dolly on the blankets. Neither of them spoke about the riders. They ate cold beans from a tin, passing it back and forth. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up toward the patched roof. Outside, the coyotes began their nightly chorus, that eerie, wavering song that had become as familiar to Mateo as his own heartbeat. He did not know when he fell asleep. Only that one moment he was staring into the flames, and the next he was somewhere else, a cabin in Colorado. Snow falling thick outside the window. Elena lying in the bed with her face the color of ash. "Mateo, Mateo, I can't breathe." He reached for her. His hands passed through air. "Mateo." Hay woke with her name tearing from his throat. The shack swam into focus. The fire had burned low, embers glowing orange in the darkness. His shirt was soaked through with sweat. His hands shook. Nijoni knelt beside him. She held a cup of water. Her face was calm, her movements slow and deliberate. She did not speak, did not ask questions. She simply held out the cup and waited. Mateo took it, drank. The water was cool, slightly metallic from the tin. It grounded him, pulled him back from the dream and into the present. "How long?" His voice came out cracked. "You call out, twice." She settled back on her heels. "I hear you." The baby slept on, undisturbed. Mateo looked at her small form, the rise and fall of her chest. "My mother," Nijoni said quietly. "She say bad dreams need fire. You talk to the fire. It listens." Mateo shook his head. "Nothing to tell. The name you called, Elena." His jaw tightened. The cup trembled in his grip. Nijoni did not push. She simply sat there, her presence solid and patient. The fire popped. A log shifted, sending up a shower of sparks. Somewhere outside, an owl called a low, mournful sound that carried across the desert. "She was my wife." The words fell out of him like stones dropped into still water. He had not spoken them aloud to anyone, not once, in all the months since the funeral. Nijoni waited. "Typhoid took her. Last winter." He stared at the embers. "I was 2 days out, cutting timber in the high country. By the time word reached me, she'd already been gone 3 days. They'd buried her by the time I got home." The fire crackled. The silence stretched. "I wasn't there." His voice broke on the last word. He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes. "She died alone, and I wasn't there." Nijoni said nothing for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice low and steady. "Garrett," she said. "He was traitor. Come to our camp with cloth and beads, pretty things. He bring me gifts. He say words like, forever. Mateo lowered his hands, looked at her. When I tell him about the baby, he smile. He say he will come back for me, take me to the white man's town, make me his wife. She paused. Her fingers traced the edge of Dolly's blanket. He ride away. I wait. 1 moon. 2, he never come back. He ran. He run. She nodded. And my people, they say I bring shame, a child with no father, no name. They do not say go, but their eyes say it, so I go before they make me. The fire had burned down to coals. The shack was nearly dark now, just the faint orange glow casting long shadows across the walls. Men run, Nijoni said quietly. Women stay. That is how it is. Mateo thought of Elena in that cabin, alone, calling for him while he swung an axe 100 miles away. He thought of Nijoni walking into the desert, heavy with child, because the people who should have protected her had turned their backs. Maybe that's how it was, he said. Doesn't mean that's how it has to be. She looked at him. In the dim light, her eyes shone. The coffee pot sat on the edge of the fire ring, still warm. Mateo reached for it at the same moment Nijoni did. Their fingers touched rough skin beat against rough skin, and both of them went still. Neither pulled away. The contact lasted 2 heartbeats, 3. Then Nijoni withdrew her hand slowly, and Mateo poured the coffee into a single cup, because they only had 2 and 1 was cracked. He held it out to her. She took it. Your wife, Nijoni said after she had sipped. She want you to live, not die in sand. She looked at him over the rim of the cup. I know this. Mothers, we know. Mateo's throat closed. Nijoni set down the cup and reached into the folds of her blanket. She withdrew something and held it toward him. Elena's Bible. The flower, she said. It fall out when I move things to hide. I put it back. Mateo took the Bible. The leather was warm from being pressed against her body. He opened it slowly. The dried wildflower lay against a page near the middle. He looked at the words beside it. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. The Book of Ruth. Nijoni could not read English. She could not have known what the words said. Mateo closed the Bible, held it against his chest, outside. The coyotes fell silent. The wind died. The desert held its breath. And then, cutting through the stillness, came the sound of hoofbeats. Not distant this time. Close. Getting closer. The hoofbeats he had heard moments ago now resolved into shapes. Mateo was on his feet before the sound fully registered. His hand went to his belt, the knife, not the gun buried in his saddlebag, and he moved toward the door. Stay here, he said over his shoulder. Don't come out. Nijoni clutched Dolly tighter. Her face had gone pale in the dying firelight. Mateo stepped onto the porch. 3 riders emerged from the darkness, their shapes resolving in the starlight. Calhoun rode in front, his bleached bone eyes catching the faint glow from the shack's window. The 2 men from town flanked him, younger, broader, their horses snorting and stamping from the hard ride. They reined up 20 feet from the porch. Dust swirled around the horses' hooves and settled slowly. Rivers, Calhoun's voice was calm, almost friendly. Didn't expect to see your lamp burning this late. Mateo said nothing. He stood with his feet planted, his hands hanging loose at his sides. The knife was a weight against his hip, but he did not reach for it. Calhoun shifted in his saddle. Leather creaked. We ain't here for trouble, he said. Just doing what's right. What decent men do when standards need keeping. It's late for a social call. It is. Calhoun nodded slowly. But some things can't wait. Word's gotten around. Rivers, about your situation out here. The two younger men exchanged glances, one of them the broader of the two, with a scar running across his chin spat into the dust. The Indian woman, Calhoun continued, and the baby. Folks in town are talking, wondering what kind of man sets up house with a savage and her whelp. Mateo's jaw tightened. Folks can talk all they want. They can, and they are. Calhoun leaned forward in his saddle. Thing is, Rivers, this ain't just talk anymore. This is about community, about the kind of place we want Dusty Flats to be, about protecting our women and children from influences. You know what I mean. Calhoun's voice hardened. Send her back where she belongs, the reservation, her people, wherever, just not here, not in our territory. Mateo felt the anger rising in his chest, hot and tight. His hands curled into fists at his sides. She's got nowhere to go, he said. Her people turned her out. The baby was 3 days old when I found them. She would have died. That ain't our concern. It's mine. Silence stretched between them. The horses shifted, harnesses jingling. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled a single, mournful note that hung in the air. Calhoun dismounted. His boots hit the sand with a soft thud. He walked toward the porch, slow and deliberate, stopping at the bottom of the steps. I'm going to ask you once more, he said. Friendly-like, man to man. Send her away. Tonight. We'll forget this ever happened. You can go back to being that quiet logger from Colorado, minding his own business, no harm done. Mateo looked down at him. Calhoun's face was half in shadow, half lit by the glow from the window. His eyes were steady, certain, the eyes of a man who had never doubted his own righteousness. No. The word dropped like a stone. Calhoun's expression flickered. Not anger, something else. Disappointment. Maybe. Or disgust. Wrong answer. Rivers. He turned and gestured to the two riders. They dismounted together, their movements synchronized, practiced. The one with the scar pulled a coil of rope from his saddle. The other carried a wooden club, not a weapon exactly, but close enough. Mateo's heart hammered, 3 against 1. He had been in worse fights, back in the mining camps, but he had been younger then, angrier, with less to lose. We ain't going to hurt you, Calhoun said, almost gently. Just going to remind you of your place, show you what happens when a man forgets who his neighbors are. They came up the steps fast. Mateo swung at the first one, the scarred man, and connected with his jaw. The impact shivered up his arm. The man staggered back, cursing, but the second was already on him, the club swinging down toward his shoulder. He twisted, caught the blow on his forearm, felt the bone vibrate with pain. His knife came free of its sheath. The blade flashed in the starlight. Enough of that, Calhoun said. Something crashed into the back of Mateo's head. The world tilted. His knees buckled. The knife slipped from his fingers and clattered on the porch boards. Hands grabbed him rough, calloused hands, and dragged him down the steps. His boots scraped across wood, then sand. The night sky wheeled overhead, stars smearing into streaks of light. They threw him down. He landed face first in the shallow pit beside the water trough, the place where water had pooled and mixed with mud from last week's brief rain. The muck was cold, thick, reeking of rot and animal waste. It filled his mouth, his nose. He choked, spat, tried to rise. A boot pressed down on his back. "Stay down," Calhoun's voice said from somewhere above him. Mateo's fingers clawed at the mud. His face was pressed into the filth, the taste of it coating his tongue, dirt and manure, and something sharp and metallic. He could not breathe, could not see. His lungs burned. The boot pressed harder. "This is where you belong. Rivers, down in the muck with the rest of the animals. You want to live like a savage. You can wallow like one." Laughter. The two younger men, enjoying the show. Mateo's arms shook. He tried to push up, but the weight on his back was immovable. Mud squelched around his face. He turned his head just enough to gasp for air. "We'll be back tomorrow," Calhoun said. "With the sheriff. We'll see what the law has to say about your situation, and if the law don't do nothing." He paused. "Well, there's other ways to handle things." The boot lifted. Mateo lay in the mud, his face turned to the side, his chest heaving. He heard the men remount, heard the creak of leather, the jingle of spurs. The hoofbeats started slow, then quickened, fading into the night. Silence. He pushed himself up on trembling arms. Mud dripped from his face, his hair, his shirt. The taste of filth clung to his mouth. His head throbbed where they had struck him. He had not fought back. Not really. 3 against 1. And he had gone down in seconds. Thrown into the muck like a duck, he dragged himself to his feet. His legs wobbled. He leaned against the water trough, retching, spitting out mud. His reflections stared back at him from the dark water, a face streaked with filth, eyes hollow, hair matted with dirt. This was what he had become, a man who let himself be pushed into the mud and did not fight. A sound behind him. He turned. Najoni stood in the doorway of the shack, Dolly in her arms. She had watched the whole thing, seen him thrown down, seen him lying in the filth, seen him retching and shaking. Her face showed nothing. No pity, no fear, just witness. "They come back," she said quietly. Mateo wiped mud from his eyes. His hands were shaking. His whole body was shaking. "Yes. With Sheriff. Yes." She stood there, framed in the lamplight. The baby pressed to her chest. The wind stirred her hair. Dolly made a small sound, not a cry, just a murmur, as if she too understood that something had changed. "I should go," Najoni said, "before they come back. Before—" "No." The word came out raw, torn from somewhere deep in his chest. Najoni stopped. Mateo looked at her, at the woman who had nowhere to go, at the baby who had done nothing wrong, at the life that had somehow taken root in this place he had chosen, for dying. "No," he said again. He spat mud from his mouth, straightened his spine, felt something shift inside him, not warmth, not hope, but something harder, colder, the kind of resolve that came from having nothing left to lose. I said no. Najoni watched him for a long moment. Then she nodded once. Behind her, the lamp flickered in a draft that crept through the walls. Somewhere far off, the coyotes began to sing again, that wild, lonely chorus that belonged to no one and everyone. Mateo walked toward the shack, mud falling from his clothes with every step. Tomorrow. The sheriff would come. Tomorrow. He would have to answer for choices he had not consciously made. But tonight, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was done running, done hiding, done waiting for the desert to finish what grief had started. He stepped onto the porch. Najoni moved aside to let him pass, and as he crossed the threshold, he heard it faint, distant, but unmistakable. The sound of horses, not leaving. Circling. The circling hooves faded some time before dawn. Calhoun's men, watching from the ridge, making sure Mateo understood they could return whenever they chose. He sat awake through the dark hours, his back against the door, the knife across his knees. Nijoni did not sleep either. She sat in the corner with Dolly, her eyes catching the firelight each time he looked her way. When morning came, gray and still, Mateo washed the dried mud from his face and arms with water from the trough. His shirt was ruined, caked with filth that no amount of scrubbing would remove. He wore his spare, the one Nijoni had mended, and tried not to think about how his hands still trembled when he buttoned it. The sheriff arrived at noon. Mateo saw the dust cloud first, a single rider, not three. He stood on the porch, his face still swollen from the night before, dried mud crusted in the creases of his knuckles despite his efforts to clean them. The stain of it lingered in his hair, under his fingernails, in the way his body tensed at every sound. Nijoni stayed inside with Dolly. He had told her to. She had not argued. The rider came into focus as he approached an older man on a gray mare, his posture slightly stooped, a tin star glinting on his chest. He rode slow, deliberate, taking in the shack, the patched roof, the water trough with its ring of churned mud. He reined up 10 feet from the porch and did not dismount. "You Rivers?" "I am." The sheriff studied him. He had a lined face, weathered by decades of sun and wind, and tired eyes that had seen too much and expected too little. His name was Tom Whitfield. Mateo had heard it mentioned in town, always in that careful tone people used for men they respected, but did not want to cross. "Calhoun came to see me this morning," the sheriff said. "Said you've got an Indian woman living here, and a baby." "That's right." "He also said you pulled a knife on him and his boys last night." Mateo's jaw tightened. "They came onto my property, 3 of them, after dark, threw me in the mud and told me they'd be back." The sheriff's expression did not change. He looked at the water trough, at the disturbed earth around it, at the dried mud still visible on Mateo's boots. "They mentioned that part," he said dryly. "They did not." He dismounted then, slow and stiff, favoring his left leg. He tied his mare to the porch rail and stood at the bottom of the steps, looking up at Mateo. "Mind if I come in? Have a look?" It was not really a question. Mateo stepped aside. The sheriff climbed the steps, his boots heavy on the boards. He paused at the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the dim interior. Mateo watched him take it in the barrel table, the crates for chairs, the fire ring with its pot of cold coffee, the blankets in the corner where Nijoni sat with Dolly in her arms. She did not rise, did not speak. Her eyes followed the sheriff the way a deer watches a hunter wary, but still. The sheriff removed his hat. The gesture was small, almost unconscious, but Mateo noticed it. A man did not remove his hat for someone he considered beneath him. "Ma'am," the sheriff said quietly. Nijoni's chin lifted slightly. She said nothing. The sheriff turned to Mateo. "How long's she been here?" "Near 3 weeks now. Found her the night I moved in. She was in the back room with the baby. Hadn't had water since morning. Baby was newborn 3 days old. Maybe less. And the father ran. Some trader named Garrett made promises, then disappeared when he found out about the child." The sheriff's face flickered something that might have been recognition, or disgust, or both. "I've heard that name before," he said. "Man who deals in broken promises. surprised he hasn't gotten himself shot by now. He walked further into the room, his boots scuffing against the packed earth floor. He looked at the mended roof, the swept corners, the small pile of supplies stacked neatly against the wall. His gaze lingered on Elena's Bible, sitting on the barrel table. "You a religious man. Rivers. My wife was typhoid last winter." The sheriff nodded slowly. He did not offer condolences. Men like him had seen too much death for empty words. "So you came out here to do what? Die quiet?" Mateo did not answer. The silence was answer enough. The sheriff turned back to look at Nijoni and Dolly. The baby was awake now, her dark eyes blinking in the light that filtered through the window. She made a small sound, not a cry, just a murmur of contentment. "How old now? 3 weeks and some days," Nijoni said. Her voice was steady. "She is strong. She looks it." The sheriff's voice had softened. He stood there, hat in hand, watching the baby's tiny fingers curl and uncurl. "My wife and I, we lost 2 before they made it to their first year. Fever took one. The other just stopped breathing one night. Never knew why." The room was very quiet. "A baby is a baby," the sheriff said, almost to himself. "Don't matter who the mother is." He put his hat back on and turned to Mateo. "Calhoun wants me to run her off. Says it ain't decent. A white man living with an Indian woman. Says it sets a bad example for the community. And what do you say?" The sheriff was quiet for a long moment. His eyes moved around the room again, the mended roof, the clean floor, the woman holding her child, the man who had come here to die and found something else instead. "I say a man who gives water to a dying woman ain't breaking any law I know of. I say a man who fixes a roof and keeps a fire burning is a man who's decided to stick around." He paused. "And I say that's more than a lot of folks manage." He moved toward the door. "Calhoun won't like this," Mateo said. "Calhoun don't have to like it." The sheriff paused at the threshold. "I'll tell him what I told you. There's no law against charity. If he's got a problem with that, he can take it up with the territorial judge in Tucson. 3-day ride. And Judge Harrison don't take kindly to men who waste his time." He stepped out onto the porch. The sun was high now, the heat pressing down. "Sheriff?" Mateo said. The man turned. "Why?" The sheriff looked at him. His tired eyes held something that might have been recognition, one man seeing another. "Because I've done enough harm in my life," he said quietly. "Enough looking the other way when looking was hard. A man gets to a certain age. He starts thinking about what he's going to answer for when his time comes." He glanced back at the doorway, where Nijoni still sat with Dolly. "My wife would have skinned me alive if I'd run off a mother and her baby." He mounted his horse, the saddle creaking under his weight. "You'll have trouble from Calhoun still," he said. "I can't stop that. But if he lays hands on you again, you come find me." He touched the brim of his hat and turned the mare toward town. Mateo watched him go until the dust cloud faded into the shimmer of heat, a sound behind him. He turned. Nijoni stood in the doorway, Dolly against her chest. Something had loosened around her eyes, something that might have been relief. "He is good man," she said. "He's a tired man." Mateo replied, "There's a difference. Maybe." She looked out at the empty desert. But tired men still choose. He choose right. The afternoon stretched long and quiet. No riders came. No dust clouds appeared on the horizon. Mateo spent the hours reinforcing the door, adding a crossbar that could be dropped from inside, just before sunset. Another dust cloud appeared. Mateo's hand went to his knife, but as the shape resolved, he saw it was not a rider, a wagon, moving slow, driven by a woman. Mrs. Henley pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the shack. She climbed down, her movements stiff from the long drive, and lifted a basket from the seat beside her. "Brought some things," she said, not meeting Mateo's eyes. "Preserves, a blanket for the little one, some flour the good kind. Not what Harlan sells to strangers." She set the basket on the porch. "Ma'am." Mateo started. "Don't." She held up a hand. "I'm not doing this for you." She looked past him, to where Nijoni had appeared in the doorway. "I buried 3 of my own. Mr. Rivers, 3 babies who never saw their first birthday. I sat in that store today and listened to my husband talk about running off a mother and child like they were stray dogs." Her voice cracked. She steadied herself. "I couldn't save mine, but maybe I can do something here." She climbed back onto the wagon without another word. The wheels creaked as she turned toward town, the dust rising behind her in a golden cloud. Nijoni knelt and opened the basket. Inside, beneath the jars and the blanket, lay a folded piece of paper. She held it out to Mateo. He unfolded it. Read the words, written in careful script. "Sunday service at the church. You would both be welcome. Martha Henley." Mateo looked up at Nijoni. She could not read the words, but she could read his face. What it say? He folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. "It says we're not alone." 3 months had changed the shack. Mateo stood in the doorway, watching the morning light fall across the packed earth floor. The roof no longer leaked. The walls had been sealed with fresh adobe. The cracks filled and smoothed. Curtains hung in the window, rough calico, that Mrs. Henley had brought on her 3rd visit. Stitched by Nijoni's careful hands, a garden had sprouted beside the east wall. Desert squash vines crawled across the sandy soil, their broad leaves catching the early sun. Prickly pear pads stood in neat rows. Transplanted from the hillside, a small stand of beans climbed a frame of mesquite branches. The shack smelled different now, coffee in the morning, roasted vegetables in the evening. The particular sweetness of a baby who had grown fat and healthy on her mother's milk. Mateo walked to the corner where he had been working for the past week. The rocking chair sat there, finished at last. The wood was rough. Mesquite was hard to work, and he was no carpenter, but the joints were solid. The runners smooth. He had tested it a dozen times, rocking back and forth until he was certain it would hold. Nijoni came in from outside, Dolly strapped to her sock in the new cradleboard Mateo had built. Her hair was loose, falling past her shoulders, and her face had filled out over the weeks. She no longer looked like a woman who had nearly died in the desert. She stopped when she saw the chair. "For you," Mateo said. He gestured toward it. "For nursing, or just sitting." Nijoni walked to the chair slowly. She ran her fingers along the armrest, feeling the grain of the wood, the places where he had sanded it smooth. Then she lowered herself into it, settling Dolly in her lap. The chair did not creak. She rocked once, twice, a 3rd time. Something changed in her full, a softening around the eyes, a loosening of the careful guard she always wore. "It is good," she said quietly. "Very good." Mateo nodded, turned away before she could see his ears redden. The days had taken on a rhythm. He hunted in the mornings, checking his snares and occasionally bringing down a jackrabbit with the old rifle he had finally dug out of his saddlebag. Nijoni tended the garden, gathered wild plants, cooked over the fire ring he had rebuilt with proper stones. In the evenings, they sat together, sometimes talking, sometimes silent, while Dolly slept between them. Mrs. Henley came every 2 weeks now, her wagon loaded with supplies and news from town. Calhoun had not returned, though his riders still watched from the ridge sometimes, their silhouettes dark against the sky. The sheriff had come twice more, once to check on them, once to share coffee and sit in silence on the porch. Nijoni's English had improved. She could hold a conversation now, though she still searched for words sometimes, her brow furrowing as she reached for the right phrase. Mateo had started teaching her to read from Elena's Bible, her choice, not his. She liked the stories. She said, the women in them, Ruth and Naomi, Esther, Mary. He had learned some of her words too, simple things, water, fire, sun, moon. The way she said his name, softening the syllables until it sounded like something different. Dolly had grown. Her face had lost the pinched look of those first desperate days. Her eyes tracked movement, now the flutter of a bird, the swing of the door, Mateo's hands when he worked nearby. She laughed sometimes, a gurgling sound that made Nijoni smile. He had not expected to feel anything again. He had come here to stop feeling, to let the desert scour away whatever was left of him until there was nothing but bone and silence. Instead, he had found this. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. Nijoni sat in the rocking chair, Dolly asleep against her chest. Mateo was repairing a harness at the barrel table, his hands moving through the familiar motions of punch and thread. Dolly has 2 names now. He looked up. Nijoni was watching him, her dark eyes steady. That's so? Yes. She paused. Dolly Rivers. Mateo's hands went still. The leather and all hung forgotten in his grip. Rivers ain't much of a name, he said. His voice came out rough. It is her name now. He could not look at her. He stared at the harness, at his own scarred knuckles, at the dust motes drifting in the light. Nijoni did not press. She simply rocked, the chair creaking softly, Dolly's breath warm and steady against her chest. Mateo set down the harness, pushed himself to his feet. He walked to the barrel table, to the place where Elena's Bible still sat. He opened it slowly, the leather cover soft from years of handling. The pages fell open to the place where the pressed wildflower lay, the same page Nijoni had found that night, weeks ago. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. He lifted the flower carefully. The petals had faded to the color of old bone, fragile as a whisper. Elena had picked it on their wedding day, from a meadow high in the Colorado mountains. She had pressed it that night, sliding it between the pages of her mother's Bible. For luck, she had said, for remembering. Mateo held the flower in his palm. It weighed nothing at all. He crossed the room to where Nijoni sat, knelt beside the rocking chair, held out the flower. She looked at it, then at him. For Dolly, he said, for when she's old enough to understand. Nijoni took the flower with careful fingers. She looked at it for a long moment, then tucked it into the folds of Dolly's blanket, close to the baby's sleeping face. Elena, she said quietly, she would want this. Mateo's throat closed. He nodded once and stood. Outside, the sun was beginning to set. The desert blazed with color, gold and rose and deep purple, the mesas catching fire along their edges. The air was cooling, carrying the scent of sage and creosote and the distant promise of rain. Mateo walked out onto the porch. The steps he had built himself, The railing he had sanded smooth. Behind him, he heard Nijoni rise from the chair, heard her footsteps crossing the floor. She came to stand beside him. Dolly stirred in her arms, making a small sound, then settled again. They watched the sunset together. Neither spoke. The colors deepened. The first stars appeared, faint and then brighter, somewhere in the distance. A coyote called that wild, lonesome sound that belonged to no one and everyone. "What you think?" Nijoni said finally. "Tomorrow?" Mateo considered the question. The desert stretched before them, vast and indifferent. The town lay beyond the horizon, with its whispers and its judgments. The future was uncertain. It always was, but for the first time in longer than he could remember, he did not dread it. "Same as today, I reckon." And day after, "Same." She nodded slowly. "Good." The word hung in the air between them, simple, ordinary, carrying more weight than either of them could name. Dolly opened her eyes. She looked up at Mateo, her gaze dark and steady, and her mouth stretched into something that might have been a smile. He reached down and touched her cheek with one calloused finger. Her skin was warm, impossibly soft. "Good," he said quietly. The sun slipped below the horizon. The desert faded to blue, and then to black. The stars multiplied overhead, scattered across the sky like salt thrown on dark cloth. 3 figures stood on the porch of a shack at the edge of nowhere, a man who had come to die, a woman who had been cast out, a baby who had been born into nothing. They did not speak. They did not need to. There is a quiet that comes after a story like this one. Not emptiness, something fuller. The kind of stillness that settles when we have walked alongside someone through their hardest days and watched them choose to stay. Many of us have stood at our own crossroads. Some of us have known what it means to be cast out, or to love someone we were not supposed to love. Perhaps you have carried grief so heavy it bent your back, only to find that the carrying itself became a kind of strength. Perhaps you have been the one who stayed when leaving would have been easier, or the one who arrived just when someone needed you most. These things do not need explaining. They simply are. It is all right if something stirred in you that you thought had settled long ago. Grief does not follow a schedule. Neither does hope. Some feelings are not meant to be resolved, only carried gently, until they become part of who we are. You do not need to do anything with what you felt here. It is enough that you stayed until the last word. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here.